Alright guys, Murph's here. And today I want to talk about the 5.7 by 28 millimeter cartridge. I want to go over some of its history as well as some of its performance type, technical specs, some contextual data as well, and then do a little bit of comparison before it's all said and done. Now this was a viewer requested video, by the way. Alright, so let's go ahead and get into history. In the late 1980s, FN decided that they wanted to put together a cartridge to replace the 9mm as a NATO standard. And the idea was to develop a cartridge that could have rifle-like performance out of a smaller, lighter platform than a rifle. Basically being able to get rifle performance out of a handgun cartridge, which is incredibly difficult to do. This is kind of a lofty goal, if we're being completely honest. In general, just based on case capacity, pressures, all those types of things, it's incredibly difficult to be able to replicate rifle-type ballistics in something the size of a handgun. So FN set out with this, and they were not the only ones to do so. There were actually trials that were held, and Heckler & Koch would submit the 4.6 by 30 to run up against the 5.7. Now, in the early 90s, there would be a lot of testing between the two cartridges, and one of the things that was being looked for was armor penetration capability, because that's going to be a major limiting factor of most handgun rounds. And it was found that the 5.7 out of the FN-P90 submachine gun, which is a bullpup type design that FN put together in order to be able to field this as a PDW for light vehicle, or vehicle crews, helicopter crews, stuff like that. Which, if you guys are interested in the PDW like concept, what all constitutes a PDW and all that kind of stuff, I'll put a link in the description of the video that I've done on that previously. Anyway, it was found that out of the P90, getting back on subject, out of the P90, the 5.7 could penetrate level 3A body armor at 200 meters. That's pretty impressive. Now, the conclusion of the trials would find that the 5.7 outperformed the 4.6. However, Heckler & Koch and the German delegation would throw a fit over this, and ultimately the trial would just be concluded and 9mm would remain the NATO standard because it's easier to just stick with what it is that you already have instead of deal with Germans, as it would turn out. Now, this would not stop a lot of NATO countries from adopting platforms chambered in either cartridge, to be completely honest, and actually the United States Secret Service presently utilizes the FN-P90 as one of their weapon system options available to them. All right, so, however, things would impact the proliferation of the cartridge and the weapon systems on the American market for a little while, namely the 1994 assault weapons ban. However, that would sunset in 2004, and the weapons platforms as well as the cartridges would start trickling in. And they would see some popularity, especially considering that the FMJ does have interesting performance type characteristics we'll talk about here in a little bit. But the FMJ being the quote-unquote armor-piercing round, it would actually wind up under the Obama administration being declared by the ATF as a illegal type of ammunition only available to law enforcement and military sales. A lot of buzzwords at the time are used, such as no sporting purpose and cop killer round. So with that, you have to be in those specialized types of jobs in order to be able to get a hold of the FMJ loading for the 5.7mm cartridge. Now, this would not necessarily discourage interest in the platform overall, as much as it's going to play a pretty big part in our contextual discussion here after a bit. And interest would further be expanded in the platform as more and more weapon systems have come online chambered in it. Specifically, there is an AR variant, the AR-57. There's also a offering from Keltec. The CMMG Banshee is made in the 5.7mm cartridge, and also Ruger recently unveiled its Ruger 5.7 pistol, which comes in about 2/3 the cost of the FN-5.7 handgun. All right, guys, that pretty much covers history on this particular cartridge. Why don't we go ahead and get into the actual description portion and start talking about some of the technical specs of this cartridge. Now, first off, size association. On the left is the 22 Winchester Magnum rimfire cartridge. In the center is the 5.7 by 28. And on the right is the 22 long rifle. All right, now let's go ahead and describe the 5.7 by 28. This is a 23 to 40 grain projectile in a Spitzer type shape, now made in ballistic tips. At one point there was a hollow point that was built. We'll talk about that more. And then of course the FMJ round that you can only get in specialized positions. Now, this is a Spitzer type projectile, which means that it is pointed. We have a 28 millimeter long casing, which is necked and rimless, and a centerfire type casing. The velocities range from 2,300 feet per second to 2,800 feet per second, which is very interesting. This is an incredibly fast cartridge, and this will play a big part in our contextual discussion. Now, getting into context, let's go ahead and talk about some of the more media or in-media type comparisons that were done. Quite a bit of testing was done around ballistics gelatin and all that kind of stuff. What you would expect out of a cartridge that's trying to get into military contracts. And what was discovered was that if you were looking at FBI expectations, FBI standards for penetration, the FBI considers an acceptable penetration distance in ballistics gelatin, calibrated ballistics gelatin with 4 layers of denim on front, to be 12 to 18 inches. And the FBI prefers that their cartridges that they select for duty use to be at the upper end towards that 18 inches. Now, the FN57 with its FMJ loading would penetrate about 14 inches, right thereabouts. And some of the interesting aspects about this penetration is with this high velocity and being a 22 caliber round, it does destabilize in media, causing it to flip end over end, which does expand its overall cavitation capability with a lighter projectile, which is interesting, especially in an FMJ type round. Now, this gets complicated when you start talking about either ballistic tips or hollow points, because they will not necessarily penetrate as deeply as the FMJ round. They're going to start expanding. And this gets us into another aspect of FBI statistics or FBI expectations standards, which is 1.5 times expansion in any expanding type projectile. With that being the case, a 22 expanding 1.5 times is not that interesting. It's not that large of a diameter at that point, and you're not necessarily getting that much additional tissue disruption. But with the FMJ round moving at the speed that it moves at, you get secondary wound track. You get a hydraulic type action in different air and fluid filled portions of the body. Those are very interesting aspects. When you switch that over to some type of expanding projectile, you limit the amount of penetration that you get out of that projectile, and you don't necessarily get the same amount of tissue disruption as it dumps the energy too early. It's not necessarily making it where it is that it needs to go, which is potentially problematic in a self-defense type situation. It's a very key thing to keep in mind here. Now, in addition to the penetration capabilities at 200 meters, the FN57 handgun has been found to penetrate body armor at as close as 50 meters. There was actually some testing done on body armor and body armor in front of ballistics gelatin at 25 meters, and it was found that not only did the 5.7 millimeter cartridge penetrate the body armor, it also penetrated 9 inches in the ballistic gelatin, which is very interesting because it's not just a matter of, it hit the plate and stopped and transferred all the energy there, which potentially caused some sort of contusion to places you don't want a contusion, right? Broken bones, some sort of internal tearing and hemorrhaging and all that kind of stuff. That's problematic enough on its own if I shot somebody with a 9mm or whatever it is that got stopped by a plate. Now you poke a hole through that, you poke a hole into the target, and you have very real casually producing characteristics that are involved with that. That's interesting. That'll play a larger part here to come. Now, kind of going, that we've kind of covered a lot of the contextual type aspects here, an important thing to keep in mind is energy. So when you look at a lot of pistol cartridges, 9mm 40 and 45 are generally guilty of this overall aspect. When you crunch velocity and mass and all those types of things and you get the projection for energy, you find that 9mm 40 and 45 are very comparable in terms of energy. Now, this does play a little bit of a difference whenever we talk about surface area and as far as like disruption to tissue, penetration distance, and all this kind of stuff, and actually being able to penetrate deep enough with an expanding projectile in order to be able to disrupt more tissue. There are things to talk about in that overall dynamic, but energy-wise, raw data-wise, they wind up equaling out to be about the same. And that's no different in the 5.7mm cartridge, which is kind of interesting. When you think about it, it's actually not that different from 9mm, which makes it not that different from 40 and 45 in actual energy transfer. It's just doing so in a much smaller area. And a lot of that, to me, comes down to the same overall principle of fighting with a handgun, which is they're not the best fight stoppers to begin with. And if that's the case, if anything deserves to be shot once, it probably deserves 4 or 5 more rounds on top of that. One of the great things, to put that into context, with the 5.7 millimeter chambered options out on the market is that they have a lot of capacity. So if you have to engage a target with the same number of rounds as 5.7 as you would with 9mm, you've got way more rounds left in the magazine to be able to handle additional threats, have more around should the situation spiral even further out of control, all those types of things. It's an interesting dynamic to discuss there. Now, in addition to that, though it's a fairly flat shooting cartridge, something else you have to take in mind as you start to push it out to greater distance, especially if you're shooting like a P90 or something along those lines, is that it's going to be more susceptible to wind because it is such a lightweight projectile. Even as you go into heavier grainage for the caliber, that's just more surface area for wind to be able to act against. It's an important aspect to keep in mind. Something that I find interesting in general whenever we talk about cartridges and ballistics and all that kind of stuff is people have a tendency to over-focus on big numbers in different categories. Some people get really bent out of shape over high grainage. Oh, well, I need this obscenely high amount of weight for a single projectile, higher than what you would normally find in a 9mm. I need a 150 grain 9mm. 115s don't do it for me. I need 150. I need that greater mass type of deal. Or then you run into people who are really big about large calibers. Well, I carry a 45 because they don't make a 46 type of guys. And then you have your high velocity guys. Well, I need a really high, I need 1,500 feet per second, 1,600 feet per second, 1,800 feet per second type ballistics because that's, speed kills. That's the thing that I need. And the reality is that when you break down the overall conversation and you actually think about it in an overall expansive fight-stopping type manner, what is going to give you the appropriate penetration distance, the appropriate amount of tissue damage, expansion, all those types of things, the reality is that it's not so much that the best option is in the middle as much as you still have to balance out all the other options that go along with it. It takes more effort than to just preference one aspect of the cartridge over everything else. And that is one of the things that I would say the 5.7mm cartridge is guilty of. Super high velocity, but it's losing out a lot of the mass type options. You need a trade-off there. Especially whenever you start to talk about expanding projectiles. It's one of the issues when you wind up with light for caliber projectiles that are moving really fast. They have a tendency in an expanding type bullet to not penetrate very deeply. Where a lot of times when you're looking at a smaller caliber projectile, you don't necessarily want expansion because you're not going to get optimum penetration, and you may not even wind up getting optimum expansion. You're actually better off poking holes in switches and timers within the body as opposed to trying to rip somebody apart from the inside. All right, so let's go ahead and do a little bit of comparison. What I really wanted to compare against the 5.7 was the 4.6, but that discussion winds up being a lot more contextual than data-driven because there's really not a lot of ammunition offerings in either option available to compare. The 4.6 has not necessarily had a lot of popularity in the American market, which is entirely blamed upon Heckler & Koch. If they would just bring in a commercial variant of the MP7, myself and a lot of other people would be very happy. CMMG, did just introduce a Banshee variant chambered in the 4.6x30. I will say that the 5.7mm cartridge does have more available options out on the market than the 4.6 does. However, that's not necessarily saying very much because there's only a few loadings available and a handful of manufacturers producing 5.7mm ammunition. In addition to that, I thought maybe we would compare it to the 9mm that it was trying to replace. However, even that's kind of difficult because the 9mm just has so many options. If you want to find your flavor that you like in the 9mm, you can. You can find some option of availability, price, velocity, penetration distance, and expansion that is going to meet your requirements in 9mm. Why it makes it so difficult to put anything above the 9mm in overall practicality, because it's so available. It has so many options. It does this, that, and the other thing. A lot of people like to take the opportunity to say that the 9mm does nothing well except be available, which is a dynamic to be taken into consideration, especially when times are troublesome. So if it's a discussion between 5.7 and 4.6, absolutely 5.7. If it's a discussion between 9mm and 5.7, I'm going to need some specific circumstances to pick the 5.7. Now, with that being the case, what would be my use for the 5.7? What are my core opinions on the 5.7mm for my own uses? And you guys might take some of this conversation so far to take it that I dislike the 5.7. which isn't entirely false. However, if I were to have an interest in the 5.7mm cartridge, it would be because I was on some sort of protective detail where I would be concerned about body armor. That's where I think the 5.7 plays out, because I like the idea of not just transferring energy into the armor, but also the person. I want, if hitting them in the chest and knocking them on their butt is good, hitting them in the chest, knocking them on their butt, and poking a hole in their lung is better. And that's what I want to have happen. That would make me want the 5.7mm cartridge at that point. Now, in addition to that, if you combine that with a P90 in its true NFA form, full automatic, short barreled, all that type of thing, now I really have an interest, because now you're talking about a 50-round magazine and 900 rounds a minute. Just a swarm of little angry 5.7mm rounds coming at you. And they defeat armor. That's cool. I'm a big fan. That's something that I would recommend for use at that point. However, if you're talking about it in a more utilitarian type manner, hey, I can only have one gun. What do I want? Or I'm looking for something for self-defense, or I'm looking for something for home defense. The 5.7 would not rate very high on my recommendation scale. 9mm, 40, 45 would be much higher, especially when it comes to availability. Now, what would I recommend you guys do with the 5.7mm cartridge? Well, obviously, whatever it is that I would use it for, I would totally recommend you do as well. In addition to that, if you were looking for a great small game cartridge, the 5.7 has some interesting opportunities. Really, even from a defensive manner, the 5.7 in comparison to, say, 22 mag or 22 long rifle has some interesting performance aspects to it, specifically being a centerfire cartridge being inherently more reliable in ignition than rimfire cartridges are. However, cost is going to play a part in that as well. But as a small game hunting cartridge, that's interesting. That can be very fun. Some people use it for hunting deer. I am not a fan of that from an ethical standpoint. And I would encourage you that if you're going to do that, you're going to take your shots very close. And one of the issues with that is it's very tempting to take longer shots should they appear, especially if you really want to bag that animal. And in that case, I would not recommend the 5.7mm cartridge for that. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on the 5.7 by 28. I hope you guys found this interesting, and if you enjoyed this content, if you want to interact with it a little bit more, there is a Merce Law Facebook page. I'll put the link in the description. Come over there and join us. We'll have some discussions, and you'll get some behind-the-scenes content and all that kind of stuff. But that's pretty much what I got for now. After my shameless self-promotion, have a good day.